Hey guys, thanks for tuning in. Did want to give a quick disclaimer. There is welding in this video, so it kind of comes out as flashes of light. So if you're sensitive to that kind of thing, I just wanted to give you a heads up. So in this video, we're working on my 1998 Nissan 240SX. We're going to be doing rust repair, clean up the engine bay. So the first part there, I just sanded the battery tray, and then I covered it with a wet paper towel that had rust remover in it. Next off, as you can see, I scraped the seam sealer. I think that gives engine bays just a cleaner look. And then right here on the shock tower, there was quite a bit of rust when I first bought the car. I just hit it with a quick thing of spray paint, kind of just a temporary fix, but as you can see, I ended up having to cut out that rust completely, and you'll kind of get a gist as the theme of rust repair is mostly just cutting out rust and replacing it. So right here, after I cut it out, I wanted to get the paint off the edges because I am going to cut out a piece of metal plate and weld in to repair this shock tower. So right here, I cut out a piece of metal plate, and I'm using the magnets to hold it in place, and then I'm welding it into the shock tower. For metal, it's generally kind of thin, and I also had a pretty cheap Harbor Freight welder, so the method I used for this was just going around the outside and tacking instead of trying to lay a seam of weld, because trying to lay a seam will actually burn through the metal. So I just tacked it in and then sanded down the welds to make sure it's smooth, because this is going to be a very visible part of the engine bay. A lot of people will see the front of the shock tower, and I realized that that tacks aren't extremely strong. So what I did here is, this is JB Weld, and I'm using a piece of wood, covering all of it, make sure there's no holes. And one quick tip you can do is just put a light behind the metal you're looking for, look for any holes. If the light comes through, definitely be sure to cover that up with the weld. So after a couple days it dried off, I came back in with a surface sander, so just trying to make this like it never even happens. I'm trying to make it perfectly smooth, using the Dremel here to get in the harder to reach spots, but try to use the biggest sander you can get to create a straight edge, because if you use a hand sanding, it'll just end up kind of wavy. So right here is another very bad piece of rust. This is the driver's side wheel well. There was rust here that goes all the way into the cabin of the car, as you can see. So that hole goes straight to the floorboard with the foot pedals. So as I was scraping back rust, it just kept getting bigger and bigger and worse, and I knew at this point I was going to have to cut out another piece of metal and weld in to replace this. Right here, I should have done a better job, honestly, cleaning it up. I did clean up more than I showed in the video, but I did have trouble welding the new metal to the old metal. But at the end of the day, I mean, all this panel is going to be is just a way to keep water out from inside the car and to stop rust in the future. So I went around, tacked in. I was having problems, as you can see, and it was burning through a little bit. Also kind of had to like hammer this to shape, because it's a flat piece of metal and I'm trying to weld it onto a curve. So once I got it on there, I hammered it down and then went back, welded it, and I did the same thing I did to the other parts of the car. So I went back with JB Weld, mixed that, put that on there, and then took a sanding attachment on a drill once it dried, kind of knocked it down, made it to shape. And keep in mind, this doesn't have to be perfect. This is on the inside of the wheel well. I'm going to paint it black. Nobody's really going to see it. So the only point of this is to keep it smooth, make it where water can't get in the cabin, and that's really all it needs to do. There are a couple more things I didn't mention. So looking back this video, I probably should have gone a little farther, because you can see that there's rust there, but in a second I go in with the palm sander, as you can see, and it actually is pretty solid steel, and it was good enough to weld to. So I think structurally it'll be fine. There is definitely a concern for like rust in the future. So the final piece here was to go on the inside of the engine bay and cut out another piece of metal, and then go in, tack weld it all around the sides. And then in addition to that, I covered this all in JB Weld after I sanded down the welds with the Dremel. Just trying to get it smooth and keep water out from inside the engine bay, prevent rust in the future. And I did want to say also that this doesn't have to look perfect. I mean, this is in the corner of the engine bay. It's going to be underneath the header, underneath the brake master cylinder, so no one's ever going to see this. And once it's just kind of smoothed over and then painted over, no one's ever going to be able to know it was there unless you watch this video. Then you might be able to at least kind of spot it, but even then it's pretty difficult to see. And I think this will do a fine job of being strong enough to support it, and then also keep water out and stop the rust. In this part of the video, I'm kind of just doing an investigative approach with the screwdriver, just scraping off the seam sealer on the panels, and I'm finding a lot more rust than I thought was there. And you can kind of see the surface rust on here. So if you're gonna buy a car yourself, it's probably a good idea to use this knowledge, and if you see anything like that, just know that it definitely goes a lot deeper. So here's the back side of that same shock tower. I'm just continuing to look into it with the wire wheel and the screwdriver, and as I'm scraping it back, I'm like, wow, this seam is basically completely gone. So eventually I'll just go in with an angle grinder, and I realized that I'm gonna have to cut out basically this entire strip of metal along the frame rail and then weld in brand new steel. So the point of doing all this was to find the line where I had rust and good steel. So as you can see in the top there, I finally found some clean steel. So once I get close to the edge, I switch over to the Dremel instead of the angle grinder, and also when the Dremel's too aggressive, I switched over to the wire brush just to see right where the edge is. And then I went in with the cutoff wheel and the Dremel and also the angle grinder a little bit to cut around that line between the good clean steel and a rust. So another thing, I really wanted to avoid as much shaping as possible, so I was trying to cut out along flat surfaces or areas where I knew it would be relatively easy to make a curve. So the next step was to cut out steel to shape, and then clean off all the edges with the wire wheel, and then go in with the welder. And I did have a lot of trouble because this metal is very thin right here, so the welder had a tendency of burning through. Even on the lowest setting, there wasn't a whole lot I could do about it. So I just tacked in, and they're not the prettiest welds, maybe not the strongest welds, but they'll get the job done. And it was enough to actually hold it to allow me to hammer into shape. So instead of the welds breaking, it actually bent the entire panel. So I kind of hammered everything down flat and then went in with the welder, cleaned up the edges, and then I will go back just like all the other parts, and I JB welded the inside and the outside just to give it additional strength. And also there was some holes in the weld, so it makes it watertight and prevents rust from getting in there. It acts kind of like a body filler. So I didn't show it here, but I did actually fill in that little rectangle spot. You can see it now as I move to the inside of the car, and I knew that entire seam was gone, so I went on to the inside of the car where it's easier to reach and just use an angle grinder and just cut out that seam. And then I followed up with the Dremel just to get the harder to reach spots and just cut out this entire seam. And again, right here, the goal of this is to knock back the rust to get to clean steel, and as you can see, I'm finally starting to get through to clean metal. And then I cut it out to shape. I went in, got a new strip of metal that's the same size. I actually used cardboard to kind of mock it up, and then overlaid the cardboard over my metal plate, and then cut out this little strip. I went in on the inside where I had clean metal, tack welded all around it. I did this for probably an hour, so I did skip a few things in the video. But then once I had it in, this metal on the bottom is actually the frame rail, so it is thick enough to put a bead of weld on, but the metal on the top is still the sheet metal of the car. It's very thin, so at the top I had to tack, and then on the bottom, as you'll see in a second, I was able to actually get in the engine bay and lay a bead down. Okay, and once I did that, I grabbed the Dremel tool and went back and just ground down the welds, and then just like everywhere else, after I had the welds pretty smooth, I covered it all in, cleaned it up first with a wire brush, and then covered it all in JB Weld. So the JB Weld is going to make this significantly stronger, especially because of all the thinner tack welds and things like that. And it also acts kind of like a Bondo layer, like a body filler layer, so you're able to sand it down once it hardens to kind of match the original shape of the panel. So with that being said, this video is getting pretty long, so I think I'm going to break this into another part. Thank you for watching. Be on the lookout for part 3 of the rust repair. Thank you.